Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So what we're going to be looking at today is creating a couple of simple weather effects. Now I'm going to focus on doing this in the high definition render pipeline. A bunch of what I'll be showing, you'd also be able to use that in the universal pipeline as well. But it is very specific to those pipelines, and in particular some of the things are going to look the best in the high def pipeline. So let's dive on in. So I want to get a suite of different weather effects going, and I want to be able to easily control and manage those. So I'm going to set up here folder for our scripts, and I'm going to set up just actually initially weather manager. And the reason I'm setting this up first is I just want to get a bit of a sense of the kinds of things that I want to be able to control. Because the idea with this is that I want something that's going to make it easy for managing different sets of weather. So what I want to be able to do is have things like rain intensity. I'm going to make this a slider. Range from 0 to 1. I want to also then be able to have, well, we've got rain. Let's also chuck in snow. We'll chuck in snow. Let's also have fog. And for good measure, let's also put in hail. So I want to have these sliders that I adjust, and that by adjusting them, I see the weather effects change. So I'm going to set up our little manager here. And then I'm going to bring that script on. So I just want to be able to, when I drag these, it changes that weather. So for a bunch of the things, what I want to use is I want to use the VFX graph. So VFX graph we have available in high def pipeline and the universal pipeline. It's really great for creating visual effects. So in particular, if you're wanting stuff that really having a large number of particles and things like that, it handles that very well. So we've already got that included, which is great. So we can close that. So what I'm going to do is, because the VFX are a separate asset, I usually group them into their own folder. So I'm going to start with the rain effect. So I go to create, and what I want to create is under visual effects, a visual effect graph. So I'm going to call this VFX rain. And then for good measure, create a visual effect here. So we're going to put all of these visual effects in the one sort of block. The effects set. So I'm going to link this up. Now, as soon as I do this, we'll see some particles appearing there. Obviously, that's not quite what we want for the rain, but that's our starting point. And so what I want is something that the rain is going to encompass this volume. So let's get started with configuring this. So when I'm working with VFX graph, I usually try and have the game view visible at the same point in time so I can be working with it. So there's a bunch of things that I want to be able to configure with this. So with all of the effects, I want them to have a intensity parameter. And I want this to work largely the same way on all of them. So I can create that float, and I set the mode to range, with a min of 0 and a max of 1, and I want to start it at 0.5. So this is going to control how intense the effect is, which that is going to actually affect our spawn rate. So we're going to set up two integers. So we'll have min spawn amount, maybe min spawn rate, and then we will have max spawn rate. We'll set up these. So min spawn rate can be 0, max spawn rate. So when we're working with something like rain, we need a lot. And by a lot, I mean max spawn rate. I'm actually going to put that at 10,000, and that might not even be enough. So based upon the intensity, it will determine this spawn rate here, which I can bring over intensity and all of these ones. I can add in a lerp operator. So X and Y are the values that it is lerping between. And the S parameter here is the proportion essentially between it. So I can link that up. So now rate is controlled by this, but the capacity is actually the main limiting factor here. So capacity, well, it's going to be based a bit on the lifetime. So capacity, if we look at our spawn rate, that's how many it can spawn per second. So if we were at our max of 10,000, could be spawning 10,000 a second. If something lived for 3 seconds, then it would mean we could get up to 30,000. Now, if I have less than that as the capacity, what can happen is you will get blocks where essentially you have no particles being spawned because it's at capacity. So your capacity there often, especially for something like a rain, I'm actually going to make it quite large. And the bounds mode, this determines whether it's going to get culled or not. So we can pre-record sets of bounds, or we can actually set it to be automatic where it's going to calculate. We could do manual. So this is something where I'll usually initially set it to manual and may change it then later on. So usually set it to automatic, may change it later on, but that way we have enough, it's not going to get automatically culled when we're not looking at it if we don't set that up properly. So, okay, good so far, but well, we need this spawning inside a box. So under position, we have set position, bounding box, and I'm going to do this as the first thing that happens here. And I will set it that it's anywhere in the volume of it, but we can give it that box. So what I'm going to do is add a parameter here, axis align box, spawn bounds. Now I will give it a default value, and by default, let's position it, say 10 meters up. And it doesn't need to be too thick. So when we're doing spawning of stuff like rain, that box is usually going to be fairly wide and deep, but not overly high. And I'm going to set the size here, bring this in, and then add this in like that. So now, in particular, if I go back to the scene view, that's looking a little bit better. We can see it's not covering the whole area. So that's where I can actually go and adjust these in the inspector here. So I could actually manually adjust the box size there, or I could go and just type in the values. So I'm going to do that. We might position a little bit higher up and make it a little bit thicker. But this is where we can see at that current spawn rate, so it'd be about 5,000, it's not actually that dense. So when you are spawning the particles in a large area, you often need pretty large amounts. So I'm actually going to change the max spawn rate here, let it go up to 20,000, which then means the capacity here, just going to give it a bit more headroom again. And the nice thing with the particle systems is it'll update pretty consistently. So far, not too bad. We've got it spawning up in the sky. We need it falling, so we need gravity applying to this. So that's easily done. We can just put in gravity. And now, those are falling, which for rain, that looks pretty good generally. Now we can adjust the texture of this. So this is something where I've already put in a couple of textures. These are quick little ones that I've made. So with these textures, I've got a raindrop and a snowflake one. So I'll link that up. And these textures, they have transparency on them. So that's something that's a key thing when you're setting up these textures. I added them, they built them with transparency, and I made sure I checked alpha is transparency when I added them in. So that already looks a lot better. The shape is looking pretty good. Color, generally the default that is there with the rain, we don't need to actually change it. The size, now we could mess with the size over lifetime. So what's happening is the size in this case is increasing over life. We could keep that. We could also chuck in just a general sort of scaling for the size if we wanted. So in terms of size, we do have an actual sort of overall thing in terms of scaling it. So we can multiply size. So if we set up a parameter here, that can be size scale. And that size scale, we'll default it to 1 and link it up. But that gives us something that if we wanted to, we could change the scale of this quite happily. So, okay, pretty decent, like with the rain. If I lower the intensity, we get very little rain happening. If I massively increase it, we get a huge, huge storm of rain particles, which is great. That's what we wanted. There's a couple of other things that we could do with this, though. We might not want rain falling too close to the camera. So that's something where, in the update, we can do a kill based on a sphere. And with all of these, you can set it to be a solid or an inverted one. So if it kills anything inside the sphere or anything outside of it, I can then say, well, let's get the main camera. And the main camera, we'll notice, has a transform. Now we only need the position of this. So I can bring over the position. And we can also set up a float here. That might be kill sphere radius, which I might set that actually to 2. Something that I've found with this, you generally end up wanting a bit of a larger radius than you expect. So that'll keep things from coming too close to the camera. So that's good. The other one that we can potentially do that seems to work okay, and I'm pretty happy actually with how it works. There's other kill options that we've got. So that sphere could be something that we provide in. So I mean, in terms of options here, you can provide spheres, you can provide planes. So we could have stuff like that. And that's great for a static environment. It is not necessarily so great for a dynamic environment. So if I add in a cube though, we can demonstrate a alternate option that we've got for this. So I'm going to put this at 0. Going to make the size of this quite a bit larger. And then I will bring this up. Maybe about 5. And I'll make it larger again. So this is something where at the moment we would be able to get, if I made that so it was even larger, we would still be able to get rain falling when we are under that. So the camera, I'm going to relocate the camera so it's fully in the shadow of it. So you can see we still get rain falling on us. And if I move it just to the edge of that, we'll see it still gets quite a bit of rain falling on the actual one. And that's even though the player is right there. So there definitely shouldn't be rain really falling in front of us if we were able to be blocking that, which we could. We could block it by a plane, a bounding box. The thing that I've found that also works not too bad is we also have these collision events. And one of the things that we can do is we can collide with the depth buffer. You see, at the moment, it's colliding with the depth buffer on the ground, but there is also the depth buffer above us. So what you can also do is, if I take that, then I get a little bit falling just in front of me because I'm not looking directly at it, but I do get more of that effect of it being able to prevent rain when we are under there. Versus if I turn that off, we'll see we get quite a few bits coming through the object. So it's something that it's not a perfect solution, but if you have something where you have an environment that it is going to be moving around a lot, this can be a reasonable way of having that be avoided, of having it actually clip through. This can take input from a custom camera though. So that's something where I'm not going to set it up with that because performance-wise, that's a little bit of a potential issue there. But conceivably, you could have a camera looking from above that is able to be capturing below, and then that depth buffer gets provided. So there's options there that could be done with that, but a second camera, especially when we're needing to render the entire contents of the scene pretty frequently like that, can get pretty expensive. So this collision with a depth buffer works pretty well though. So I'm actually going to leave it in with that because that I find is a pretty decent effect. Now the ground, we might want it to react to that though, because that effect when it was colliding with that looked pretty good. So we're going to do collide with plane. I will make it that I can provide the ground plane, which I will link up here. And then the rain, I can link up the ground plane. Now you see, it doesn't immediately appear here as an option. So we have to actually, to bind more complex ones like that, what we have to actually do is, you can see it's exposed, but we go and we add a VFX property binder. So we've got the property binder. Now there's a lot of different things listed under here, but you'll notice under utility, there is plane. So we can add that in. So we can link up the target, which is this one. And then we have to set the name of this. And you'll notice it goes green. That's really important. If it doesn't go green, it's not going to actually be connected with it. So for now, I'm going to turn off the collide with depth buffer, just so we can see how it looks when it's hitting on the plane. And so we can see what's happening at the moment when it hits the plane is it just sort of, not really that much happens. Now I want to save this, make sure it's got everything updated. So we can see it does actually hit it. It bounces a little bit, which is good. So with the rain, it doesn't really make sense for it to bounce, but we can have it kill it at that point. With something like the hail, that would actually make more sense when we do that, of having it be able to bounce. But if we wanted to, we could have it be bouncing a little bit, and we could have a bit of a loss there of its lifetime. But generally what I would say is in this case, we don't need it to bounce, but losing that lifetime is good. So, okay, that's pretty good. We've got our rain effect up and running. So let's make the weather manager so it's able to be controlling that. So we want to have serialize field. So I'm going to bring in, using Unity Engine, VFX, and I'm going to have rain VFX. And all it will do is, that's a visual effect. So I'm going to keep track of float previous rain intensity. So we'll check here if rain intensity is not equal to the previous. We update that, and then we say, hey, rain VFX, I want to set float intensity, and I want to set it to rain intensity. So this same logic, I will be able to use this for snow and hail. So the reason I built rain first was because it uses a lot of stuff that the other ones will then use and just make slight modifications to. From the weather manager's point of view, well, we just have almost identical setup here, except it's just going to be using different variables. So it's referring to different things. So we are going to author all of the visual effects so that intensity is able to control, whether it's actually present or not and how strongly it's present. This just gives us a very straightforward, consistent way of working with this. So although I haven't set up the the hail or snow effects, this will be pretty much right to go as soon as they are set up. But what I'm expecting to be able to do is now, when I link this up with the weather manager, so I'll need to give it that rain. Linked up to it. So I expect now to be able to run this, and then as I adjust the intensity here, it should adjust the intensity in the game. So you can see nothing's fed through yet, and that's because we haven't done any initial setting. So we want to make sure in start, we set that at least once. And now when I run it, we should see no rain, which there's none. But as I adjust the intensity here, it's going to change. So that means the weather manager can very easily switch between different weather effects just by adjusting its version for those sliders. So that's good. So the rain, I'm going to drop its intensity down to 0. And then I'm going to duplicate that. This is going to be snow, which I will link up. And I'll make sure it's setting the initial intensity there for it. So I'm going to make sure it's setting that. And then the VFX, I can duplicate that as well. So I'll just duplicate that existing file, because I'm quite happy with the setup for how the rain one works. So that gives me a good template version. And that duplicated the entire folder, which was not intended. Duplicate that. So this will be VFX snow. So I'm going to link that up. Now the intensity, I'll let that be back at 0. So snow needs to work a little bit differently. Obviously, one of the big things is it should look different. So with the snow, I'm going to switch texture. Now it's falling quite rapidly. So we want to adjust that speed that it is falling at. So what I'm going to do is, one of the things I'm going to do is add in a bit of turbulence. Because snow, it's lighter, we expect it to be sort of drifting around. So having the turbulence there is going to work well. And I'm also going to, with snow, lower the force here a bit. So I'm going to lower gravity. It's just going to make it fall slower. But you notice immediately, as soon as it's falling slower, its lifetime, it's not hitting the ground. So because we've shortened that, we need to increase the lifetime. But then we're also going to hit limits with the number of particles. So snow, we probably don't need as high a spawn rate. We can probably get by with dropping that to maybe 10,000. Maybe bumping it back up to 15, because there's going to be a lot more of the particles around. That's the thing to be aware of. So 15 is not too bad. So we've got the turbulence there. Now we've got different noise types. So could also mess with them. And I think the Perlin one I find looks a little nicer. I like the sort of weaving that it does a lot. But that's our snow. It's got an intensity, it's got everything else set up there. So again, we should be able to, with our weather manager, ramp up the snow. I'm going to go to my weather manager and let's bring in some snow. And because the effects work separately, we could have rain as part of that. So we've got something where we've got a lot of control now over how this is working. So let's get the hail happening. Unsurprisingly, we're going to duplicate the effect here. Now it's going to be a little bit different in that the hail, I'm actually going to have the hail be meshes, will be what it will be emitting. So again, Weather Manager, we link that up. We make sure that exactly like what we've done with these, we set that initial intensity. And then we're going to come in and adjust the hail. So hail, we'll let that be on. So let's go and edit that. Now, a couple of things I'm going to do with this. Firstly, I'm going to get rid of the turbulence. Don't really need the turbulence with the hail. The gravity, I will restore it back to what it was. Now, in terms of what it outputs here, I want to actually output a particle mesh. Now, in my case, it's just going to be a cube. So I'm going to select that the mesh, rather than being won't be a capsule, it'll be a cube. The texture, if there is just a plain white 1 pixel texture, we might use that. There is, we've got a 1 pixel white texture, which is perfect. So I can actually move a lot of these other things over. So you can just drag and drop, which is really handy. Orientation, doesn't really need to orient it. We could orient it with the velocity, would be an option. So we can just set that, orient it along the velocity. That's pretty good. We've got these cubes falling now. We've got a scaling for size, everything like of that. Now these are ones that when they hit the plane, whereas we did have the lifetime loss. So in this case, I'm going to have it that there is a bit of bouncing that happens. And give it a bit of friction. Now the size of these is definitely something where we want to firstly lower the max spawn rate. We definitely don't need as many with this. And I think the default size can be a lot less. The lifetime loss, we can chuck in a little bit. We get a little bit of bouncing there. We could drop it so the lifetime loss is maybe a little bit higher. Now that orienting with velocity that it's doing, I think is what's causing that little bit of a flip we see. So we'll try without that, and that looks better. So in this case, we won't do any orientation of it. So the scale for these, I actually am going to get rid of that set size over life because I think that set size over life is probably increasing the size a little bit too much. So I'm actually going to have it that what we'll bring in is a set size, and we'll just link that up here. We'll get rid of our multiply and the size over life. Just give us a bit more control over it. Probably have it be smaller. That's better. Get a little bit of bouncing of the hail. Again, we can tune that level of bounce and tune things like the friction and the lifetime loss. Those are going to work well for giving us the different visuals we're after. The key thing is we've now got hail happening. Then my weather manager, I should be able to do rain with some hail or rain with snow. All these different combinations I'll be able to do. So let's bring in some rain. Let's add in hail. So we've got some nice effects happening there. Hail, you could also have some different meshes there. You could use spheres. There's a bunch of things we could be using there with it. If we wanted, we could also check in. So we've got snow. Performance is obviously going to take a bit of a hit. Having all of those on is going to have a pretty massive effect, because so you do want to balance the amount of ones that you're going to have there. So, okay, that's pretty good. But we don't have fog yet. So fog we do differently, because fog we do via the volume system. So this is where I'd add in a volume. So we've got volumes, and we want to add in a box volume. I'm going to call that fog. Now I need to set the size of that so it encompasses everything. So that's where 200, I believe it ends up being. Yep, 200 by 200. Doesn't need to be super high. Like the height of it does matter, but we don't need to have that be super high. Then that needs to link to a profile. So we can create that by, under the create side of things, we can create a volume profile. So we could call that VFX fog volume. And then I can link that up. Then we add in an override, and we can add in fog. And we turn it on so it's enabled. And then we can adjust settings. So the lower the attenuation distance is, then the faster that fog sets in. So we can see it's setting in much closer. So this is something you would have to tune based upon your particular needs in your game. It's going to vary a lot from game to game. So if I bring that into 50, the height also is going to have an effect. So that you can, if we notice, if we set that to 5, it's much less of an effect. If we set it to higher values, then that fog has more of a vertical layer to it. So it's again having more of an impact. We can make it so that it is going to be volumetric, so it's going to affect things in terms of volumetric lighting and that, which can be really handy. We've got a bunch of things that we could also bring in. So you can bring in that fog pretty close. And you'll notice we also have this weighting setting, which can work pretty well for controlling that fade in of the fog. So what I'm going to do is link up here Unity Engine rendering. Then we have a volume, fog volume. We'll also have previous fog intensity. Now we can work with the fog volumes by doing a fog volume weight. and that's equal to the fog intensity. Now we also could be working directly with some of the parameters there. So it is possible to directly go and modify settings on that profile while it is running. But often just the weighting will actually be enough. So fog volume, and then its weight, and we have the previous fog intensity. So that's going to give us something where once I link that up, we can adjust the fog. So I'll link that up. I will by default set that fog weighting to 0. And then now we run our weather manager. And let's bring in some rain. So we're going to have intense rain. And then we can also bring in fog. So that's something where you could directly mess with some of the fog parameters if we were wanting to, but we can also just adjust that weighting there on the fog volume. Can be a really effective way, but you could adjust things like the attenuation distance if you're wanting to dynamically change and bring that in. Now the process of working with that for the volumes is a little bit not the nicest. It's not the cleanest of interfaces, but once you get your head around it, then it's generally pretty much the same code you use in every case. So if we want to actually be able to modify the fog directly, what we can do is we can go fog volume, and we can access the shared profile. And then within that, how we generally work with this is we do a try get. And what we try and get is the particular volume component. So if you're trying to work out what the ones are there, you can try, typing in ones is not necessarily going to find stuff, but a way that you can often do this is if I go to the profile, then what I can do is, you can't often access the script there, but if you turn on debug, you can then see the components, and you can see that it has this fog one, which has this fog script. So you can do that to find the particular ones, which when you eventually get through it, you can find that it is under this namespace, and here's the class. So debug mode can be really handy if you're trying to track down things like that. Can be a bit of a nightmare to track them down. Otherwise, the documentation will often try and mention it, but it can be hard to find things. So I've got that namespace. So I can try and get fog. Now try and get it gives you the component. So what I would have is fog cached fog component. And that is an out, because that might not have succeeded. That's normal. Now what I might want to be able to control is with the fog, that distance range. So if remember on the fog, if we go back to the particular effect, has this attenuation distance. So I could have a min attenuation distance, and that would be at the minimum amount that it's ever set to. That would be when the fog intensity is at its worst. So we could make that really close in. And I could also have a max attenuation distance, which I might set to 50. And then I'll label these as both fog, so it's clear what they're referring to. Then when we update the fog volumes intensity, what I'm going to do is, if cached fog component is not null, we need to work out what setting we change here. And if we go cached fog component, then we can usually then access under that. We could do distance. Well, there's a couple of ones there. It's not necessarily clear which one it would be. But if we look at the particular one, what we can do is we can match the name here, fog attenuation distance, with this. So we can go fog, attenuation, and we can see we have this mean free path. So that distance is the one that we can change. So we can go mean free path. With the mean free path, we can then, let's say we go, okay, well, we have a mathf lerp from max fog attenuation distance to min based upon the fog intensity. But we'll see that won't work because it's trying to convert from a float to this. So these, we have to do dot value. I'm going to bring this so that it's all on separate lines, so it's a little bit clearer. So then this same logic here, I can bring this over to here. So what I should find is that the fog attenuation distance now changes as the fog intensity is changed. Let's test and see if that's working the way that we want it to. So we've got the volume is set to 0. So that's good. So the fog, as I ramp that up, it comes in a lot closer, and we can see, if we look at the fog, that has been updated for its attenuation distance. Now, always good to make sure you check. Now it has, you can see, it has gone and changed that original one there. And let's double check that it has actually modified it. And so what we'll probably find is when we go and run this, it's actually modified that original asset. So we'll change the weather here. We will update that fog intensity. And then if we stop it, you can see that it's changed. So generally, we're going to change that to profile. And that should be accessing the unique one. Something to just be mindful of, that it's very, very easy to inadvertently with these things modify the asset, because not everything in Unity obeys that. A case of, okay, you change it in the editor, it's not remembered. Some things do get remembered. So the fog still works, which is good. And if I stop it, well, attenuation distance is is at 10, but let's just run it again and make sure that it's not modifying that actual asset. So we can see fog attenuation distance is 50. We adjust this here, we can see that it's 10. We stop it and it returns back. So just something to be aware of, that when you're modifying those things, otherwise it's very, very easy to inadvertently change an asset. Now let's also see if we untick that, because we will likely find, if it follows the same rule that the other post-processing profiles do, notice it doesn't properly work. So we often need to actually tell it that we're wanting to override things. So with that, the mean free path, you can see how we've got stuff where we can tell it to override. So that's where I can override it and give it a value. So if I do that, let's watch what happens. Need to fix up that. We'll run it again and we'll see, okay, how does it now behave? We adjust the fog intensity and we notice it's back to working. So that's just something to be aware of. The other thing we can then see is, okay, well, if we're doing the overrides that way, does it still go and modify it if we use shared profile? Good to just check so we get an understanding of, if we run into a weird problem, whether or not it's, what the actual cause is of it. So fog intensity, that's working. And we can see it does still go and modify it. So that is something to be aware of. So what I will do is we'll return that to profile and bring that in. But now we can bring in rain and fog, and they can link this stuff up quite nicely. So you can imagine you could queue off a weather effect of a storm, and that just sets these sliders to particular values. So just changing these means you're able to give a very different sort of feel to the game. You know, we could also have these tie into adjusting lighting and things like that as well. You know, we can bring in little bits of hail, so you can control the intensity of what it is that the player is encountering quite easily just through a couple of simple sliders. So dive on in and experiment with this. A lot of these bits will just directly work also in the universal pipeline. So now we've got a fairly easy to use setup for being able to do different weather effects and switch between them. A lot of this stuff will also work in the universal pipeline, so the rain, snow, and hail will. Fog would need to be worked with likely differently, depending upon the particular setups you're working with in universal. It will still have fog options, just won't necessarily work in the same way. So we are using very specifically the high-def pipeline's fog. We could also adapt this again to the built-in pipeline, but again, it would need different settings. But this kind of structure works quite well for being able to have different effects that you can switch between, which is something that I do want to have a look at a later point, is being able to have these weather effects sort of change gradually and have them vary a bit over time so that we can create a really interesting experience for our players. Thanks folks, hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe, it really helps out, it's really appreciated. If you are looking for the code for the project, it is available up on GitHub, and the link to that's in the description below. There is also in the description below a link to the video archive where I put all of the videos, and that's something that's searchable. You can find all of the different videos there that you might be looking for. If you have any questions, chuck in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, I do have a Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description below as well. But until next time, bye.